7 in the evening, you walk into your kitchen, there's a plate of pasta on the table. Why is there pasta on the table? Here are two answers. One answer, because flour and water under heat and pressure formed a starchy matrix. That matrix was combined with proteins and fats, undergoing Maillard reactions at 350 degrees. Gravity then held the resulting mass on a ceramic surface. Answer 2, because your roommate knew that you had a hard day and wanted you to experience something nice. Both answers are true. Neither is the wrong answer. But they're answers to fundamentally different kinds of questions. Or rather, they're different kinds of why. That distinction between two completely different kinds of explanation is the move at the heart of Swinburne's chapter 2 of the existence of God. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to convince you that this distinction matters more than almost anyone realizes. Because it's the conceptual move that lets Swinburne ask his real question, is God the best personal explanation for the existence and shape of the world? So let's get into it. First, a quick recap. If you saw the last video, you'll remember where we landed. Swinburne's strategy is to take all the major arguments for God's existence, cosmological design, consciousness, miracles, religious experience, and treat each one as an argument that raises the probability that God exists. Then we ask whether taken together, the cumulative case clears the line. And we noticed at the end of that lecture that every one of these arguments shares a common structure. They all claim that God is the best explanation of some feature of the world. So before we evaluate any of those arguments, we need to know this. What kind of explanation are we even talking about? And that's what today is about. Part 1. What is an explanation? Start with something simple. What does it mean to explain why something happened? Swinburne says every good explanation has two parts. There's the what, the thing that brought the event about, and there's the why, the reason the what had the effect it did. Take high tide. What brought about the high tide? The moon being in a particular position relative to the earth and the ocean, that's the what. Why did the moon's position have that effect? Because of the laws of gravitation, masses attract each other with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. That's the why. Cause plus reason. The what and the why. Every explanation worth the name has both. One more distinction we'll need. An explanation can be called full or partial. A full explanation makes the outcome inevitable. Given the causes and the reasons, the event had to happen. A partial explanation just makes the outcome more likely. It raises the probability without guaranteeing it. Smoking partially explains a particular case of lung cancer. It raises the probability, but it doesn't make that person's cancer inevitable. Plenty of smokers never get cancer. Plenty of non-smokers do. So that's partial. Boiling water at sea level fully explains why your eggs cooked. Given the heat, the protein, the laws of chemistry, the eggs had to cook. Full explanation. Hold on to that, because it will matter later. Part 2. Scientific explanation. Okay, the first kind of explanation Swinburne talks about, the one you're probably most familiar with, is what he calls scientific explanation. Here's the basic shape. You have some initial conditions, the way the world was set up, and you have some laws of nature, general rules about how things behave. Plug them in, and the event you're trying to explain comes out the other end. The match was struck, that's the initial condition. There was oxygen and dry wood, more initial conditions. The chemistry of combustion is what it is, that's the law. The result, fire. The asteroid was on a certain trajectory at a certain time, initial condition. Newton's laws of motion and gravitation are what they are, those are the laws. Result, the asteroid hits the moon at exactly the time we predicted. This is the model that the philosopher Carl Hempel made famous in the middle 20th century. It's sometimes called the covering law model, because every explanation involves bringing the event under some law of nature. Cause plus law equals effect. That's the structure. And it works most of the time. Almost every explanation in physics, chemistry, biology, geology has roughly this shape. It's how science makes the world intelligible. But notice what scientific explanation never mentions. Purposes. Reasons in the sense of what something is for. The asteroid doesn't crash into the moon in order to do anything. The match doesn't burn because it wants to. Laws of nature don't have intentions. They just describe how things go. That's important, so let's hold on to that. Part 3, a quick detour. What are laws of nature anyway? I want to take one quick detour before we move on because there's a fascinating puzzle lurking here that most people never think about. I just said scientific explanation involves laws of nature, but what is a law of nature? Sounds like an easy question. It isn't. Philosophers have been arguing about this for centuries. There are 3 big answers on the table. I'll give you the one-sentence version of each. Answer 1, the Humean view. Humean from David Hume, the well-known philosopher who lived from 1711 to 1776. Laws of nature are just descriptions of patterns. There's no deeper necessity. It's not that the copper had to expand when heated. It's just that all the copper anywhere at any time does expand when heated. The law is the pattern. That's all there is. Answer 2, the universals view. Laws are necessary connections between properties. There's something built into the property, being copper, that connects it to expanding when heated. Not just a pattern, a real modal tie, something that had to happen. Answer 3, the powers and liabilities view, which Swinburne himself will defend. Laws are really descriptions of what things, what objects, what substances can do and tend to do. Copper expands when heated because copper has the power to expand and the liability to exercise that power in the presence of heat. The law is really a summary of these stable powers in the substances themselves. I'm not going to relitigate that debate today. Swinburne is careful to say that his arguments don't depend on which view you take, but I bring it up because I want you to notice something. Even in the most basic kind of scientific explanation, the kind that doesn't involve purposes or persons at all, there's something deeply mysterious going on. We're appealing to laws, and we're not even sure what laws are. Keep that in your back pocket. We will also come back to it. Part 4, personal explanation. Now the second kind of explanation, the kind that comes up when we explain things by appealing to persons. Why is there pasta on the table? Because your roommate made it. Why did Caesar cross the Rubicon? Because he wanted to seize power in Rome. Why is your tax return filed? Because you decided to file it. Swinburne calls this personal explanation, and he says it has 3 ingredients. First, there's an agent, a person, a rational being, someone who can have purposes. Let us call them P. Second, there's an intention, what P, this person, meant to bring about. Call it J, for the purpose or intention behind the action. And third, there are the person's basic powers, the thing the person can just do directly, without doing anything else. Let's call those X. Put them together. We have an agent with an intention exercising a power. That's the structure of every personal explanation. There's a subtle but important distinction here. Some actions are what Swinburne calls basic actions. These are things that you just do directly. Moving your hand, wiggling your toes, speaking a word. You don't do those by doing something else, you just do them. Other actions are mediated actions, things you do by doing something else. You signal a turn by moving your arm. You break down the door by kicking it. You light the candle by striking the match. Both kinds count as personal explanation. The difference is just how many steps the agent's intention has to go through to reach the effect. Okay, so that's personal explanation. Agent, intention, power. Now comes the move that breaks the chapter wide open. Part 5. Why personal explanation isn't just scientific explanation in disguise. A lot of philosophers, maybe most philosophers since the 1960s, have wanted to say that personal explanation is just a special case of scientific explanation. That when we explain why your roommate made the pasta, what we're really doing is identifying a brain event that caused certain muscle movements in accordance with the laws of neuroscience. In other words, the intention to make the pasta is really just an event in the brain, and that event causes the body to move. And that's a perfectly ordinary causal claim. No difference in structure from any other physical process. That's the reductionist view. It tries to reduce personal explanation to scientific explanation. And it's seductive, because if it's true, then there's really only one kind of explanation in the world, and we can stop worrying about persons being something metaphysically special. Swinburne thinks this view is wrong, and he gives a beautifully simple counterexample, originally due to the philosopher Richard Taylor. Here it is. Imagine someone sitting in an audience listening to a speaker. He's shy. He desperately wants to get the speaker's attention, but he's too embarrassed to raise his hand or say anything. So instead, he just sits there, fidgeting nervously and blushing. Now here's the thing. His fidgeting actually does get the speaker's attention. The speaker notices him. So we have a desire to attract the speaker's attention, a behavior, fidgeting and blushing, and the desire caused the behavior, and the behavior produced the intended result. By the reductionist standards, that should count as an intentional action. The internal mental state caused the behavior, and the behavior produced the intended outcome. Done. But it isn't an intentional action. He didn't fidget in order to get the speaker's attention. The fidgeting wasn't something he did on purpose. It was something that happened to him because he was nervous. Notice what this shows. You can have a mental state that causes a behavior that produces the very effect the mental state was about, and still not have an intentional action. So intentional action can't just be a mental state causing a behavior. There has to be something more going on. What's the missing ingredient? Swinburne's answer is that having an intention isn't a passive state of an agent. It's not something that just happens to you, like a sensation. Having an intention is something you do. It's already an exercise of agency. So to intend to move your hand just is to try to move your hand. In other words, intentions aren't causes of actions in the way that brain events are causes of muscle contractions. Intentions are the reasons for actions. They belong to the why, not to the what. And the reasons are not the same kind of thing as physical causes. This is a deep move. The reductionist treats intentions as part of the what, as causes in a chain. Swinburne says no, intentions belong to the why. And the why of personal explanation isn't reducible to the why of scientific explanation, because the why of scientific explanation is just laws of nature, and laws of nature don't have purposes. Part 6, going deeper, what reasons reveal about us. I want to push on this a little further because I think there's an argument buried in this chapter that Swinburne never quite states outright. But it's there underneath the surface, and it connects to themes he develops at length in some of his other books, especially The Evolution of the Soul and Mind, Brain, and Free Will. So let me try to connect it for you. Take this as my reading of where Swinburne's picture ultimately leads. Start with something we've already established. Human actions are done for reasons. You file your taxes because you had a reason to. Your roommate made pasta because she had a reason to. Now notice something peculiar about reasons. Reasons don't just cause actions, they justify them. When I asked you, why did you do that? And you gave me your reason, you're not just telling me what pushed you. You're telling me what made the action make sense. What made it worth doing. What counted in its favor. That's a strange property. Think about it. A billiard ball doesn't get justified in moving when the cue ball strikes it. The cue ball just pushes it. Neurons firing don't justify a muscle contraction. They just trigger it. Push, trigger, cause. That's the entire vocabulary of physical explanation. Nothing in physics or chemistry or neuroscience counts in favor of anything. The physical world, described scientifically, is a world of forces, not a world of justifications. But reasons do justify. When I say I promised I'd be there, that doesn't just cause my showing up. It makes my showing up the right thing to do. So here's the first conclusion. Whatever reasons are, they aren't just causal descriptions of bodily movements. They belong to a different category entirely. The category of things that make actions appropriate, sensible, justified. Now take one more step. We grasp reasons. You and I can recognize that a promise counts in favor of showing up, that pain counts in favor against touching the stove, that the evidence counts in favor of the conclusion. We're not just caused to respond to these things the way iron filings respond to a magnet. We want to understand them. We see why they matter. But here's a puzzle. If reasons aren't physical states of the world, if they're not the kind of thing a scanner could detect or a physics equation could describe, then our capacity to grasp them is a capacity to be in touch with something that is beyond the inventory of science. And that's the conclusion of the reconstructed argument. Human beings have a faculty for grasping things, reasons, justifications, norms, that don't show up anywhere in the scientific description of reality. The philosophical tradition has a name for the seat of that faculty. It is called the soul. Now, you can resist this argument at several points, and plenty of philosophers do. Maybe reasons can be naturalized. Maybe grasping a reason is, in the end, just a very sophisticated causal process. These are live debates, and I'm not pretending to settle them in a YouTube video. But I want you to see what's at stake. If the argument works, then the irreducibility of personal explanation isn't just a logical curiosity. It's a window into what we are. Creatures who don't merely undergo causes, but answer to reasons. And notice how it neatly connects to theism. If there can be agents whose defining activity, grasping and acting on reasons, already outruns the categories of physical science, then the idea of a purely non-physical agent isn't a wild leap. It's an extension of something we may already be. Part 7. Can one thing have two explanations? Here's a question that comes up naturally. If personal and scientific explanations are really different in kind, does that mean a single event can only have one explanation, either scientific or personal, but not both? No, and it's important to see why. Take the simplest case, you move your hand. There's a personal explanation. You intended to move your hand and you have the basic power to move it. There's also a scientific explanation. Nerves fired, muscles contracted, and the hand moved in accordance with the laws of biomechanics. Both explanations are true. They don't compete, they mesh. Why don't they compete? Because the scientific story explains how your intention was efficacious. It tells you the physical mechanism by which the intention got carried out. And conversely, the personal story explains why those particular nerves fired at the particular moment. They fired because you decided to move your hand. Each explanation, in a way, helps the other one. They tell different parts of the same story. That's the normal case. When you have a personal explanation working through a physical body, you'll usually have a parallel scientific story about the body's mechanics. Both can be fully true. But, and this is going to be important, that's not the only situation. There's another possibility. You can have a personal explanation where there's no corresponding scientific story, where the agent's powers and intentions don't depend on any physical substrate at all. And that's exactly what theism claims about God. Part 8. God as personal explanation. When the theist says God explains the existence of the universe, or the order of the universe, or the existence of conscious minds, what kind of explanation are they offering? A personal explanation. God is an agent. God has intentions. God has basic powers. Cause God to want the universe to exist. Cause God to have the basic power to create universes. And you have an explanation for the universe existing. This is an explanation that we will go into more detail in later, but that's the basic form. And Swinburne is very careful here. Explanations involving God differ from ordinary personal explanations in two crucial ways. The first difference: God's action cannot be given a parallel scientific explanation. There's no underlying brain state, no nervous system, no body through which God acts. When you decide to lift your arm, there's a physical story about neurons and muscles. When God decides to create a universe, there's no analogous physical story because God isn't physical. This isn't a defect, it's a part of what God is supposed to be. The whole point of theism is that God is an ultimate explanation. There's nothing more basic beneath God for science to study. The second difference: God is supposed to be a person without a body, pure spirit. What does that even mean? Swinburne actually gives a very careful answer here. Having a body, he says, involves four things. There are certain physical motions you can perform directly, for example, raising an arm. Your mental life depends on the body. A knock on the head can disrupt your thoughts. You learn about the world through the body, through your senses, and you have a viewpoint, a place from where you see things. God, on the traditional theistic picture, has none of those four. God doesn't act through a body. God's thoughts don't depend on any physical organ. God doesn't acquire knowledge through sense organs. And God doesn't have a particular viewpoint. God knows the whole of reality directly, without a limited perspective. So the theist is proposing something very specific, a personal explanation of cosmic scope in terms of an agent who is not embodied. Whether that's a good explanation is a question we haven't yet asked. That's what the rest of the book is going to be about. But what we've established today is that it's a coherent kind of explanation. It's not category confused. Personal explanation is real, irreducible mode of explanation in everyday life, and theism extends it to the largest possible scale. So where are we? Two kinds of explanation: scientific, appealing to causes and laws; personal, appealing to agents, intentions, and powers. Personal explanation can't be reduced to scientific explanation. Taylor's shy audience member shows us why. A mental state causing a behavior isn't the same thing as a person doing something on purpose. And we push deeper. Reasons don't just cause, they justify. And our capacity to grasp justifications looks like a capacity that outruns the physical inventory of science. If that reconstruction is right, the irreducibility of personal explanation tells us something not just about explanation, but about ourselves. But the two kinds of explanation can coexist. Sometimes a personal explanation runs through a scientific mechanism. Your hand moves because you decided to move it and because nerves fired. And theism, Swinburne tells us, is a personal explanation, but one with two unusual features. God's action has no scientific substory, and God has no body. So now we have the framework. Two kinds of explanation. Theism is one of them. But, and this is the question that will drive the next lecture, when is it actually reasonable to invoke personal explanation rather than scientific explanation? When does it make sense to say, this happened because someone did it on purpose, rather than this happened because the laws of physics played out? We need criteria. And criteria are what Chapter 3 is aimed to give us. Until then, here's a question worth thinking about. If personal explanation is real and irreducible, what does that mean about you? When you make a decision, when you do something on purpose, is that really something different from your neurons firing? Or is the feeling of free, intentional action just a story we tell ourselves about the neurons? Swinburne has a view on this. I have a view on this. I'd love to hear yours. Drop it in the comments. If this was useful, hit subscribe. There's a lot more coming. I'll see you next time.